Due to technical difficulties, this is a re-recording of the sermon that was preached on July 24th. Between last week and this week, we are sort of slogging our way through a couple of the most difficult passages in Samuel. For the second week in a row, as you met with God throughout the week, reading these passages, praying your way through the daily worship guide, I can't imagine that you felt overly encouraged. If you did, you might need to go see a doctor and get some help, because these were not encouraging passages. So let me encourage you now. If we can learn to read these passages well, we can learn to live well. Actually, if we can read these passages well, we will hear God calling to us to trust Him in the middle of the very worst moments of our lives. Those moments where all of the signs point in a single direction, saying the same thing. We are failing. This morning, we're going to reflect on how to trust God and how to stay faithful to Him when our lives, when the church, or when our nation seems, by all ordinary measures, to be losing. This morning's passage, it revolves around King David. And now there are plenty of other people who show up in the story. Actually, there are so many that it can be hard to keep track sometimes. You have Absalom, David's son. You have Ziba and Mephibosheth. You have Shammai and Barzillai. You have Ahithophel and Hushai. But in the midst of all of these people, David is at the very center of them all. To be more accurate, David is being pushed from the center. The question of David and his ongoing relationship with God stays at the very center of everything that happens. Let me offer you just a quick overview of the story, because we're covering a lot of chapters this morning. David's son, Absalom, plans an elaborate takeover scheme. He spends 4 years building support until the day finally comes when Absalom calls on his supporters to come together to get ready to make their move for Jerusalem, to take for himself his father's throne and the kingdom of God. David learns about Absalom's plan at the very last minute, and he discovers that this isn't some half-baked, poorly executed coup, but that the hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom. And so David ran. This morning's passage is about David running back into the wilderness from the heights of kingship, of a throne, in the center of the capital, to the depths of the wilderness. Now, for Israel, the wilderness has a powerful place in their memory, in their imagination. The wilderness had been a place of preparation. It was where God took His people to teach them, to recognize His voice. It was where He took them to teach them that they could trust Him. It is the place then where Israel's faith and loyalty were put to the test. The wilderness can be one of the most disorienting experiences in all of life. Think about Israel's experience coming into the wilderness. Even though they had just left bitter, oppressive slavery, God brings them into the wilderness and they struggle. It probably seems awkward and maybe even inappropriate to call slavery comfortable. But when it's all you've known, when it is familiar and you know where your next meal is coming from and you know where you're going to sleep, to leave this sort of certainty, stability, and familiarity, to follow God through the unknowns of the dangerous wilderness, it can be insanely hard. What makes it even harder to go into the wilderness is when you've already been there and done that. And now you have to go back into the wilderness and do it all over again. The wilderness can feel like a devastating fall from the highest of heights when you have already come out victorious and you have built for yourself a life and a kingdom, when you are living out a measure of success, only to go back. This is David's story. From the very beginning, God chose David. God called David to be king. And David waited. David waited for a long time for God to make good on that promise, on that calling, on that choice. And he waited for that day to come. And as David waited, the signs were not good that it would ever happen. With each passing year, he seemed to get further and further away from the throne. I mean, think about where David started. David started as Saul's trusted servant and general. He started close to the king, close to the throne, so that you could imagine David looking at that throne every day and going, it wouldn't take much for God to bump me into the position. But then as Saul refused to give over the kingdom, he began to become violent against David, and David was forced to run for his life, and it was into the wilderness that he ran, where he lived for years, continuing, even in the wilderness, to serve Saul and to serve Israel, and there waiting patiently and trusting that the Lord's promises were indeed good and trustworthy. David lived in the wilderness. Most importantly, it was in his waiting that David learned that being king isn't what defined him. Rather, David became obsessed with being a man who loved God and trusted the Lord. This is what consumed David. So that he basically learned that he could love God anywhere. He could love God in the palace courts as Saul's assistant or general, and he could love God out in the wilderness cave, far from the promises of God. He could love and trust God in any circumstance. This was a good and important lesson for David if he was going to be a good and faithful king. But if David had focused on being king, he could have easily become discouraged by his worsening situation, and he easily could have grasped for the throne. He easily could, at any number of points in the journey, said, this is too long, I shouldn't have to wait this long, this is too hard, and he could have compromised his relationship with God by taking Saul out, making himself king. But instead, he waited and he trusted. And while God was busy using David's patient waiting to form his character, Saul became even less patient. His efforts to kill David only increased and became more threatening, so that David had to flee even further, pushing beyond the wilderness where he waited for a time. I mean, it was almost a year and a half later. And we don't like to wait weeks, but waiting a year and a half longer after years of waiting. Finally comes, Saul dies, and David is anointed as king. But even this, he's just king over one of the tribes of Israel. And it would take another 5 years before the rest of the tribes would accept David as their God-anointed king. Finally, King David was living in the fulfilled promise of God. And it was through David as king that God began to fulfill more of his promises, more of the promises he had made to Israel and to the world. God finally delivered Israel from a number of the enemies who had been a constant threat through the period of the judges. And God also then began through David, through Israel, to begin to bless the surrounding nations. I mean, David is at the highest of highs. But now, this week's passage has David running back into the wilderness, running backwards to save his life, to save the city that he has served for so many years. It could easily be said that this is the worst moment, if not one of the worst moments of David's entire life. Ousted by his own son, the hearts of his people stolen from him, abandoned by many of his faithful administrators and advisors, exiled from the people that he has given his life to loving and serving, and ultimately unsure because of his sins in previous weeks, unsure of where he stands with God. What does it mean for David to trust God in the midst of this trip back into the wilderness, in the face of losing everything that God had given him? For us, this passage prepares us to think about loss. I mean, as individuals, we could think of loss in any number of ways. We might think of the loss of a home. We might think about the loss of a job. We might think about the loss of a spouse, maybe through death or maybe through divorce. Having worked hard to get something, a house, a job, a spouse, to build something, a life, maybe even believing that God wanted you to have these things only to lose it all. What does it mean? We could think about loss as it relates to the church in America. Over the last several decades, we've watched the church lose ground that it held in American society. A smaller percentage of Americans identify as Christians. A smaller percentage of Americans attend churches on a regular basis. Many Christians feel as though laws and social norms that once favored and promoted Christianity have been undone or have eroded. Some feel as though the church is being exiled to the margins of American life. What does it mean? We could think about loss as it relates to a local congregation like this one. Over a period of time, conflict within the congregation, pastoral changes, a building project, people walking away from their faith, and people leaving to participate in other congregations resulted in discovery, becoming a shell of its former self, so that 5 to 6 years ago, there were a number of longtime faithful members of Discovery who were deeply concerned that everything God had given to us was going to be lost. What does it all mean? And we could then extend this a bit further. Loss as it relates to a nation, our sense of what America is. The feeling that this nation has lost its place in the world. The feeling that it's changing beyond recognition. And that what was good and may have been God-given is being taken away. Right? What does it mean? What does it mean for us to trust God when it looks like you have lost everything you were living for? How do we trust God when the church or our congregation has lost the things that once defined our success? And how do we trust God when a nation declines or when a nation divides? If you read the passage this week, or if you've been reading as a part of your small group, you may be thinking, I don't remember this passage being about all of that. In fact, you might be remembering that this passage is just basically a mess of human sin. It's a mess with people positioning themselves around power, and it's a mess theologically. One of the reasons that this passage is so difficult for people is that there's almost nothing that's clear about it. I mean, for example, it's a mess of human sin. And so we might start out by asking the question, well, who's to blame for everything going on? Whose sin is causing all of this trouble? And we would easily jump to Absalom. Absalom, his entire coup is the result of Absalom carefully and meticulously scheming against his father over a long period of time. This is deliberate. And this planning comes after years and years of living in exile himself, which comes after he killed his brother, which comes after years of resenting his brother for hurting his sister. He has been nurturing this, cultivating this in his heart for a long time. And so this is all on Absalom, right? Except Absalom's murder of his brother was actually an attempt to right his father's wrong. Now, he might have been wrong in the way that he did it, but he was seeking justice. And then, after seeking the justice his father wouldn't enact, Absalom's father refused to forgive him. His father pushed him into exile, pushed him out of the kingdom. And then when David finally decided to bring him back, David refused to have a relationship with him. And when he finally then brought him into his presence, David treated Absalom like he was nothing more than just a common citizen. Years of a father refusing to be a father. Years of neglecting his son, mistreating his son, alienating his son, helped feed and fuel Absalom's hatred and bitterness toward his father. So whose fault is it? Who is to blame? Sin is a mess. And it often compounds itself in human relationships. One of the lessons for us here is that many of our losses in life are the result of our sin. Sometimes it is sin against us. If you lose your house, it could very well be that wealthy bankers have taken advantage of a system and have taken advantage of you with predatory loans. They've used the system against you. It's their sin against you. But sometimes it's our sin. If you lose your house, it could be that your greed, your envy for what your neighbor has led you to buy more house than you could afford. Sometimes the sin that brought you to the place you're in is almost indistinguishable, having gone back and forth between us and them, us and others for so long that the sin isn't entirely clear, but except that it's some combination of our sin and their sin. A sin is a mess, and it destroys. It's also important to point out that I'm not saying that our sin causes God to judge us and take from us what we have. If you lose your home, it's not necessarily that God is reaching out and grabbing it from you, because sometimes sin's natural course leads to loss. Sometimes our own sin judges us. Look then at what sin does to people. It almost always divides. And as people divide, they begin to position themselves. They begin to seek power. They begin to align themselves with power, primarily to make sure that nobody else gets power over them or establishes power that could be used against them. Now, we heard a bit about this during our reading this morning, but there's far more. Ahithophel, David's chief counselor, joins with Absalom. King Ittai, comes and aligns himself with David. Abiathar and Zadok and the Levites have come to follow David, but David urges them to stay in Jerusalem and to serve there as secret messengers for him. And then there's Hushai, David's longtime friend who wanted to join David, but David urged him to stay close to Absalom, to stay close to Ahithophel, to be David's inside man. And then we learn about Ziba and Mephibosheth. We don't see or hear from Mephibosheth early. We only hear from Ziba, who comes to David and tries to gain David's favor by turning Mephibosheth in for siding with the rebellion. Though, by the time we get to the end of the story, we learn that there are more sides to this story. When David returns to Jerusalem, Mephibosheth comes to David and says Ziba had been guilty of lying, of abandoning Mephibosheth in order to come and to gain favor. And then there's Shimei, the descendant of Saul, who comes and curses David as he travels. Both Absalom and David have loyal generals. They both have loyal armies who have sided with them. The sides have been drawn, but in the midst of division, it is not always, if ever, clear who is with whom. It's hard to tell where people's loyalties lie. As local congregations go through loss, it's often marked by messy division and political positioning. Sides often form. Sometimes they form around age. Sometimes around the number of years that you've been in the church. Sometimes they form around worship style preferences. Sometimes loyalties are connected to pastors and to staff, making it difficult for a congregation to know whether people are loyal to the community or to a person, to a style, to a program. When a church is in decline, it is rarely clear whether division formed first or whether division was the result of the decline. And it becomes especially impossible, nearly impossible to determine which group represents the best interests of the congregation. Right? Is it the young? Or is it the mature? Is it the newcomers? Or is it the old-timers? Is it the people loyal to the previous pastor or the people invested in the new one? And this is a central concern in our passage, whether or not it's clear to all of the different players who best represents Israel's future. Is it David? Or is it Absalom? Both seem to be legitimate kings. Who is the future? Who represents God's favor on the people of Israel? See, people form up sides assuming the future is with one man or the other. But then you have a guy like Ahithophel, who wisely sees the possibility of success for Absalom. In fact, God promised that one day a son of David would rule over Israel, and so sees in Absalom the possibility that he is this figure, this one to reign after David. But then Ahithophel discovers pretty quickly that he's actually chosen the wrong side. And when he sees this, he begins to despair and he begins to fear for what will happen to him for having chosen the wrong side. Choosing sides in a community that's already gripped with sin can sometimes be really dangerous. And so Ahithophel takes his own life. There's another reason why the politics, the positioning for power is such a mess. Sin has divided the people. And now the people feel this need to position themselves for power and around power. And all of this because they are a theological mess. Now, I know many of you would hate to be called theologians, but it's a simple fact. If you think about God, if you think about who God is, and if you think about what God is up to in your life and in the world, you, my friends, are a theologian. And a huge part of what's going on in this passage is that there are all of these different people trying to make sense of what God is doing. And there are some really bad theologians in the mix. Part of what makes this such a difficult passage is just how ambiguous God is in the midst of it all. From chapters 15 to 19, we're covering 5 chapters this morning. In all of these stories, there is only one person at one point in the entire story who prays to God. And in all of these chapters, there is only one instance where the narrator actually tells us definitively that God is doing something, that God is acting. And so we're left to wonder, what is God up to? The reason that this is significant is that with only one prayer and only one clear statement about what God is doing, there sure is a lot of God talk. There are a lot of people talking about God. A lot of people talking about what God might be doing. But there surely is a lot of confusion about what he's actually doing. Absalom, the one who started this entire thing, the one who rallied the troops around him, he steals the hearts of the people by telling them that he will give them the Lord's justice. He speaks on behalf of God. Of course, he doesn't actually understand that his view of justice is corrupt. See, he mistakes justice with vengeance. And so he speaks for God. He promises to meet the people's needs, but he offers them a counterfeit version, a counterfeit God, a counterfeit justice. But he uses God's name to enlist support. And then there's Ahithophel, who is so wise that speaking to Ahithophel is like you were speaking to God. This is what we're told here in Samuel. Eugene Peterson makes the suggestion that these are the kinds of people that we learn to trust more than we trust God. So that when we have questions, when we are trying to understand, we ask them rather than pray. Peterson comes up with this suggestion because it's only after David learns that his closest advisor, his wisest advisor, Ahithophel, has abandoned him, that David prays the first prayer we've heard in chapters. And then there's Ziba. Ziba, who talks about the glory days. He doesn't do it for himself. He does it for Mephibosheth, but he gives us insight into one of the ways that people are sort of understanding what God is doing. And apparently, right now, David losing his kingdom to Absalom is opening up a way for God to return Saul's family to prominence, to glory in Israel. David is the one who took Saul down. And now that David is being taken down, Saul and Saul's family are being restored. And then there's Shimei, who sees the revolution as justice. Justice for David's bloodshed. And so Shimei believes that the Lord has given the kingdom, taken the kingdom from David and given it to his son as a way of paying David back. And then there's David. And David expresses uncertainty about all of it. David says things like, if I find favor in the Lord's eyes. Or if the Lord says, I have no pleasure in you. David doesn't seem to know what God is doing. And he seems to think that maybe Shammai is justified in his criticisms, which suggests that David legitimately believes that maybe God is judging him for his sins. And here's the bit that then even makes this all a bit more messy. God told David that David's family would be divided. Check. This whole coup is plenty of evidence that David's family is divided against itself. God also told David that the kingdom would not depart from his family. And so, even still, David has a legitimate basis to believe that this rebellion is God ordained, God directed, that God is judging David. In fact, based on God's own words, it is clear that Absalom has created a profoundly ambiguous situation. What is God up to? And this story makes it clear. It depends on who you ask. It's interesting that of all of the different figures who speak on God's behalf, who suggest the possibility of what God might be doing, the only person who seems to see things clearly is the Gentile, the pagan, the Philistine ruler, King Ittai. And with him, the various Canaanite people who confess that they don't think that God has abandoned him, that God is still with David. When Ahithophel takes his own life, he is the first insider in Israel to see things as they are. At least so far as he sees that David still has God's blessing with him, although he's wrong about how David will respond to his rebellion. It's in that moment that someone within Israel finally has eyes to see. Ahithophel recognizes that God has intervened in a definitive way. The one time we are told in these 5 chapters that God acts is when we're told that he has undermined Ahithophel's advice. Which is really interesting. God intervenes, which means that he is not done with David yet. David has not stopped being his king. But what's so interesting to me is that God doesn't intervene during Absalom's planning. In all those years where Absalom is scheming and organizing and moving, God doesn't intervene. And he doesn't intervene during the overthrow. He doesn't stop Absalom from moving into Jerusalem. But God only intervenes at this late moment. There is no evidence that God wants this to happen to David, and yet he allows it to. We can't say with any certainty why. Maybe this will be enough to show David the severity of his sins against his family and against Absalom. Maybe this is what David needs to see. Not just how he sinned with Bathsheba and Uriah, but how sin has become a pattern in his interactions with Amnon and Tamar and Absalom. This story represents the same theological mess that is often at the heart of our lives. It's often at the heart of our personal losses. It's often at the heart of the church's loss, of our congregation's loss, and even national loss, where we ask the question, what is God doing in the midst of these circumstances? Our losses feel as though God is abandoning us, that we have lost God's favor. What is God doing? Certainly in our own lives, in the church, in our nation, there are a lot of opinions floating around. There are a lot of ideas about what God's up to. Some are quick to say it's God's judgment. God is judging you. God is angry with you. Others are quick to use God to baptize their own agendas. God is blessing me. God wants me to do this. And still others, like David, are ready to say with humility, it may be the Lord's will. If this passage teaches us anything, it trains us to look for sin, to look for and name our own sins, and to identify the sins of others against us. It trains us to see the way that sin, whether ours or others, divides. And it trains us to see the way that division then pushes us to grasp for power to use against each other. And this passage teaches us to see what is happening in light of God's promises. God never promises that we won't lose anything, that we won't lose the things that we've acquired in our lives. He hasn't promised us that we won't lose positions of influence or authority in society. He hasn't promised us that churches won't go through significant loss. And he hasn't promised us that a nation will not lose what it has grabbed for itself. The other thing that's interesting is that about David in this passage is that it goes out of its way to remind us what David has not lost. This passage from the very beginning continues to refer to David as one thing, to call him king. The narrator refers to him over and over again as the king. While people involved in the story, David himself doesn't understand what is happening. As outsiders looking in, we do. David may have lost everything associated with him being king. He lost his capital. He lost part of his army. He lost some of his generals. He lost some of his counselors. He lost his throne. David has lost everything associated with being king, but he hasn't lost being king. That leaving Jerusalem, going back into the wilderness, didn't stop him from being king because it was God who made him king, and God hasn't stopped letting him be king. God hasn't taken that away. And we do well to trust that unless God has given us a clear indication that he has changed kings on us all of a sudden, we ought to keep our eyes fixed on the king that he has named. This is clearer for us. There's less ambiguity about it for us, being on this side of the story of Jesus. When God names a king, God can be trusted to sustain that king. So that when you seem to be losing everything, when the church seems to lose everything, when your nation seems to be losing everything, God's word to us is fix your eyes on the king and follow him where he goes. Because the king has lost nothing. The king has not lost control. In fact, this king, our king, Jesus, the Son of God, has demonstrated to us over and over again that he seems to actually work best not at the center of power, not in the midst of signs of power and greatness, but actually at the margins. That our King seems to work best from a position of weakness and service. That it's actually in the grave. I mean, can we think of anything more weak and pitiful than being dead, being in the grave? It is in that place that Jesus demonstrates that he has lost nothing. That the God who raises the dead is the one who gets to call kings kings. No matter who would try to push the true king out, no matter who would try to overthrow that king, no matter who would try to say they are better or more fitting to be king, God gets to decide who the king is. As Jesus enters Jerusalem in each of the Gospels, we find him entering the city as their king. God has chosen him. And the people are ready to accept him. And then he walks right into the temple, the very place where the true king should be anointed. But he doesn't let them anoint him as king. And instead he's arrested, and then he is beaten, and he is humiliated, and he is shamed, and then he is forced to carry his own cross out of the city. The very same city that David marches out of weeping. And Jesus is left to die a criminal's death in the wilderness. It shouldn't surprise us when people's hopes for Jesus as their king are crushed. It shouldn't surprise us that they begin to hopelessly turn their eyes from the one they thought was their king and begin to wonder what was next, who truly would be king. And as God demonstrates with David leaving the city, going into the wilderness, David is still king. And on the cross and in the grave, Jesus is still king. And we come to the table this morning to remember what God did to prove that when everything seems to be lost, his plans have not been thwarted. That God's promises are good and true. And that even in death, God can overcome. In fact, he has. And so we come together at the table to celebrate this morning. That no matter what you think you have lost, no matter what direction the world seems to be going, Jesus is king. And he continues to reign today. And he continues to invite us to keep our eyes fixed on him and to trust that he is the one who can provide. He is the one who can protect. He is the one who, if we are willing to give our lives over, even unto death, he is the one who on that final day will raise us as he was raised. Let us come together.